Hi everybody. It's kind of eerie because I can't see myself, but okay, maybe if I do this, just setting myself up really quickly so I can have my notes open. Cool. There we go. That's what I wanted. Hi, thank you all for coming to this meeting and listening to me talk. The name of my presentation today is called Putting the Pieces Together, Community, Climate, and Birds. So first of all, a little bit about myself. My name is Campbell Simmons. I am a lifelong birder. I've been birding since I was about 11 years old. I don't really remember time before I was birding. And yeah, I live in Philadelphia, though I'm originally from San Francisco. That's where I started birding. I'm the Resilient Communities and Policy Associate at an organization called River Network. River Network is an organization that supports community-based organizations and other organizations who do river advocacy work. So we convene peer learning spaces, we help people navigate policy, and we share examples of ways to best support their rivers, essentially. We also do a bit of re-granting work, doing community-led research work, but my work specifically focuses on climate resilience. So yeah, that's really like what my specialty is. I'm also an in-color birding participant. I love those walks, so I may or may not have seen some of you there. I'm also a Healing Through the Land / Circuit Trails ambassador, so really I love getting people outdoors and helping people connect with the land. I also work on some flood resilience efforts here in Philadelphia in the Eastwick community, down in Southwest Philadelphia. But yeah, so when I was invited to come give this talk, they said, yeah, can you come talk to us about like climate justice and yeah, and just like your work and whatever you really want to talk about. And that was a little bit too much freedom for me because I got really excited. And I opened my phone. I was at a conference talking about Indigenous wildlife conservation. And I basically wrote like 4 pages of notes. And I have spent like the time since then just trying to make those notes understandable. So that is really what I'll be presenting on. But really, I wanted to start us off with some definitions, clarifying definitions, because I find it really helpful to make sure that we are all working with the same vocabulary. But I have 5 definitions here that I'm going to share with you all. The first, I'm also sure that many of you have probably heard all these words before, but I really want to make sure that we're kind of working off the same frameworks here. First is environmental justice. Environmental justice is a movement based on the principle that oppressed peoples are the most impacted by environmental harm. And when addressing environmental harm, we must also address systems of oppression, i.e. racism and white supremacy, ableism, homophobia, colonialism, etc. There are 17 principles of environmental justice. I will not be going over them because there are a lot, but I highly recommend looking into them if you ever get the chance. They're a great kind of framework to understand what environmental justice is really about and how to embody it in our communities. Climate justice is really a branch of environmental justice that specifically focuses on the climate and understands the climate crisis and systems of oppression as deeply entangled. But yeah, the next definition I have here is climate resilience. Should I admit people when they? Sure. Okay.
I think Barb will also do it.
Okay, perfect, sweet. Okay, I won't think about it. But the next definition I have here is climate resilience, which I define as successfully managing and coping with the impacts of climate change. Systemically marginalized peoples, groups of people who are targeted and harmed by systems of oppression. The last definition I have for you all is frontline communities. So these are communities facing the brunt of climate change. So flooding, wildfires, extreme heat, extreme storms. And so some examples of some frontline communities, I mean, right here in Philadelphia, there was like an article written by WHYY saying that Eastwick residents might be like some of the first climate refugees in Philadelphia. There are also the Gulf South is like a great example. Lots of communities in Louisiana are being impacted by climate change at really high rates. Also in part because many of these communities have been historically underinvested in and do not have the infrastructure to successfully cope with the impacts of climate change. So frontline communities and systemically marginalized peoples, those are separate definitions. They are not synonymous. That being said, it is a Venn diagram, and there is a lot of overlap. So as I'm going through this presentation, you might hear me say one, and I just want to make sure that we all understand what I'm talking about when I use these terms. But yeah, so as a quick overview of this presentation, I have three main goals. The first is to demonstrate the importance of centering people and specifically frontline communities in crafting solutions to the climate crisis. The second is to explain how humans and birds are interconnected and what it means to cultivate just solutions to the climate crisis that hold both the well-being of people as well as birds, nature, and wildlife. The last is to emphasize the importance of relationships in crafting climate solutions. But yeah, so back in November, I attended this conference by Taproot Earth called the Summit on Climate and Environmental Justice, Racism, and Law. And it was one of the best conferences I'd ever been to, and I kind of had to tie some of it into this presentation just because it was so exciting to me. But it was full of grassroots organizers from frontline communities, representatives from environmental nonprofits, environmental lawyers, and some legislators as well. And one of the best activities that I want to share with you all that we did at that conference that was so valuable was this triple Venn diagram. So it was 3 circles, and it looked like this. On one side, it said what we really need. On the other side, it said false solutions. In the center, it said what is politically feasible. And I think the reason I found this so poignant is because I had never seen a group of people focusing on the environment having such a candid conversation about what we really need and what are false solutions. And I am starting this here because through all of my experiences, and this is really like starting as a kid. I mean, my first job was as a kayak instructor. I was in high school teaching people how to kayak, and there was a lot of environmentalists in that space. So I really feel like I have seen such a spectrum of approaches to environmentalism, to conservation, and to climate advocacy. And I find that in pursuing the road to climate justice, the road is paved with false solutions. Right. There are a lot of things, there are a lot of easy pitfalls that I see people make and that I've made myself as well. And so I wanted to kind of start us off by talking through some of the bigger ones that I've encountered in my work and explain why I believe that they are false solutions. And so the first one that I'm going to start us off with is what I refer to as a humanless environmentalism. So I want to talk about the harm of a humanless environmentalism. So to kind of explain what I mean by that, I used to work for an organization called the Wilderness Society, and I was doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work for them. And the Wilderness Society is known for having been founded by the same person who penned the Wilderness Act and really being instrumental in the passage of the Wilderness Act. And it's considered, the Wilderness Act, for those of you who don't know, is considered one of the most intense designations of conservation that a land can have. It severely limits like the actions that people can take on that land, and it really kind of preserves the land in a really pristine way. And the Wilderness Act defines wilderness as land untrodden by man. And it's really the groundwork of how, or I think of it as the groundwork of how a lot of conservation organizations and conservationists think today. And if you have ever had the chance to read The Trouble with Wilderness by William Cronin, he does a really excellent job of kind of explaining why wilderness as a concept is a societal construct. It's not exactly real. So first of all, there is no land untrodden, particularly in the United States. Indigenous people have lived on this land on every corner of this continent since the dawn of our existence. And furthermore, And yeah, and he really kind of gets into that piece of it, and also talks about how humans are a part of nature. Really, we've kind of separated ourselves from nature, like in a lot of conservation spaces, but really, like, we have always had a relationship to the land around us. And I really want to emphasize that humanless environmentalism results in the devaluing of human life. So I'm talking about this idea of wilderness, of this idea of untrodden land. So if you look at like American public lands throughout history, so many of our national parks, and I'll use specifically Yosemite as an example, were created with the removal of indigenous people. So the Awanichi in Yosemite kind of famously were really brutally removed from that land when they had lived on that land for time immemorial. And if you look at the history of public lands in the United States, of recreational public land in the United States, so much of it was conserved at the expense of the indigenous people who lived there originally. And furthermore, so often was that land conserved for the few and the white and the wealthy. Many of the national parks were segregated. Many, like environmental spaces in general, have been segregated throughout history. So when I was really working at the Wilderness Society, I feel like so much of my work doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work was really about trying to get us to kind of reckon a little bit with that history and understand that humanless environmentalism is something that needs to be contended with. It's something that we need to reckon with and understand how deeply it hurts people. Because even though obviously we have come a long way, and our national parks don't look that way anymore, or they aren't segregated anymore. And even though public lands have become far more accessible, there are still roots of this humanless environmentalism in a lot of conservation spaces. And I'm curious if anybody here has ever heard rhetoric, or even said rhetoric. I mean, I know that I probably at one point in my life has. Rhetoric similar to like, oh, well, humans are the problem. Once we're all gone, the earth is going to be fine. Like the earth will recover, but humans suck. Like that's really where we're coming from. Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, seeing some raised hands. And I can't see the Zoom right now, unfortunately, but yeah, it's really common. But I really just want to emphasize that humanless environmentalism is really kind of a tool to devalue human lives, and that it's really important to try and get back to an environmentalism that values human life, that puts communities first. That is one of the larger false solutions that I see on the road to climate justice. But the other point that I really want to make here is that devaluing human life and human harm and environmental harm go hand in hand. So devaluing human life results in environmental harm. And I know that that's kind of a big association to make, but really, I'm trying to decide what piece of this I want to share first. But yeah, so anyways, environmental harm and human harm go hand in hand. Devaluing human lives results in environmental harm. But I want to make sure that I'm sharing some examples of that with you all. So how does devaluing human life exactly result in environmental harm? Well, I want to start with the elimination of buffalo in the United States. So for those of you who might not know this history, during Manifest Destiny, when the United States was expanding westward, they wanted to make space for white settlements, and they believed that they needed to remove the indigenous people in order to do so. They also understood that the indigenous people of the plains deeply revered the buffalo, viewed them as family members, as spiritual centers, and relied on them for food, for clothing, and for a lot of other things. And so the United States government actually funded the extermination of millions of buffalo, and left the population to only 200 at one point. And obviously there has been massive conservation efforts, and we have the buffalo back today. But this is an example of how devaluing human life and how putting profit and wealth over human life has resulted in ecological and environmental harm. And you can see this repeated throughout human history. I mean, just think about like pretty much any war. Think about scorched earth policies, the dropping of napalm. I mean, you can look at Israel and Gaza right now and see how the bombing, the destruction of the land is coming with the devaluing of human life. You can also, for a less obvious example, that you can think about retail food waste. So grocery stores waste about 30% of the food that they have in their stores, and there are about 44 million malnourished or food insecure people living in the United States. But it is not profitable to feed people over throwing out this food. So really, it's kind of this endless pattern throughout human history that we see of devaluing human life, putting wealth and profit over human life, resulting in ecological and environmental harm. So when I am talking about like a humanless environmentalism, I really want to emphasize how important it is to understand that humans and nature are a part of each other. Humans are a part of nature, they're an extension of nature. And as we are working towards climate justice, as we're working towards a sustainable future, that we are able to hold that. But yeah, so I've been talking this whole time about humanless environmentalism as a false solution. But so how do we actually pursue climate justice? And that, I think, is really kind of a central and important question that we need to be asking ourselves. So I always think of starting in frontline communities, right? And I want to emphasize how important it is to center the self-determination of frontline communities when pursuing climate justice, when pursuing climate resilience and solutions to the climate crisis. So it is really important to understand that the people experiencing an issue, the people experiencing the negative impacts of environmental degradation and/or climate change have invaluable insight on how to fix said issues. And I'm bringing this up because I talk to a lot of people who live in frontline communities, and I also talk to a lot of environmentalists every single day. And something that I hear time and time again is how people tell stories about how scientists, engineers, and environmental nonprofits will come into communities where they have no relationships and try and insist that they know what a community needs better than the people living in that community themselves. And that's not really a sustainable way of working towards solutions to environmental issues. So if you really want to build a sustainable future, you need to be involving the people who are a part of these communities. Because number one, frontline communities are not monolithic. Every single community needs something different. And when you are talking to a community in the Gulf South that's dealing with flooding, it's not going to be the exact same as talking to a community that's dealing with flooding here in Eastwick, right? Or here in Philadelphia. Every community is going to need different things. They're going to have different considerations, and the people who live in that community are going to know where to start. So that's why it's so important to really center the self-determination of frontline communities. So if you really want to build more sustainable solutions, when you come into a community, you build relationships and you offer your experience instead of enforcing your opinion over the community and devaluing that actual lived experience. That is something that I feel like I am continually learning. You know, it's always a project to figure out, how am I building the self-determination of the people in these communities? How am I making sure that I'm always listening, that I'm following their lead and bringing my expertise as a tool for them, and not just enforcing what I think is right over what the people in this community know that they need. So that's a really central thing that comes up a lot in climate resiliency planning. So I really wanted to emphasize that. But yeah, and it's really a beautiful thing when it works. When you have communities that lead their solutions, you can get pretty amazing things to happen. And so I have two examples of why it's so important to listen to communities about their needs, and examples of communities being more tapped into their environments than self-proclaimed experts. But the two examples I have here are Hazel M. Johnson and braiding sweetgrass, which I'll get into in a second. But Hazel M. Johnson, for those of you who haven't heard of her, is considered the mother of environmental justice. You may have heard of the father of environmental justice, Robert Bullard. But Hazel M. Johnson's story is that she was living in a community in the south side of Chicago that was experiencing disproportionately high cancer rates. And after her husband died of cancer, she decided to start looking into it. And she organized with her community, she organized with her neighbors, and they discovered that the reason that there were such high cancer rates in their community was because there was a significant amount of toxic waste and pollution in their neighborhood. I believe she called it the circle of pollution hell. And they were able to get together, though, and to work together to clean up their neighborhood, to get the pollution out of there, and to protect each other. And it was kind of amazing because it was just came from people leading the charge for solutions that worked for them. I also have this other example of braiding sweetgrass. It's a book by Robin Wall Kimmer, who is an Indigenous botanist. Y'all may have read it, may have heard of it, etc. But in braiding sweetgrass, she talks a lot about the importance of Indigenous ecological knowledge. And really, you could kind of talk about this forever and ever and ever, because there are so many examples of Indigenous ecological knowledge, but I'm specifically talking about braiding sweetgrass today. But basically, when sweetgrass was declining, a group of Indigenous basket weavers came to Robin Wall Kimmer and asked her if she would do a study on proving that harvesting sweetgrass was actually helpful for it to grow. And so she and one of her grad students put together this whole project. And it was really, at the time, quite revolutionary, because botanists at the time were like, harvesting any plant is going to harm this, will harm it. Like, that's just how it works. You're killing the plant. But over the course of this study, they found the exact opposite. They found that harvesting the plant actually really benefits sweetgrass. So not only is it an example of a community understanding what they need, and a community having unique insight into their environment and their surroundings, but it's also an example of how humans are a part of nature, and whether or not we acknowledge it, we have a relationship with our surroundings and our environments. But yeah, so I also just want to emphasize the power of a positive relationship between systemically marginalized communities and nature. So the two prior examples that I just gave, both Hazel Johnson and the basket makers, were tapped into their surroundings and their environments in a really special way. And I also want to emphasize that it's a tool of systems of oppression. It's a tool of white supremacy, of colonialism, of slavery, and ableism, to destroy the relationship between people and nature. That's because if systemically marginalized peoples and nature have a positive relationship, if systemically marginalized peoples can manage their own resources and are not reliant on people in power for food, water, and safety, then marginalized people will have the power to overcome systems of oppression. And so that is why you so often, like, this is kind of like a common thread throughout everything, but yeah, it is highly beneficial and it's highly profitable to make sure that systemically marginalized people don't have a relationship with nature, because then you can exploit them so much easier, so much more easily. But yeah, so I wanted to emphasize that. And so as we are trying to build towards climate justice, as we're trying to build sustainable solutions to the climate crisis, it is really centrally important that we are doing whatever we can to build positive relationships between systemically marginalized communities and nature. And this brings me to birding. So why is birding important? Well, birding, at least in my life, has connected me to the world around me, but really it's a proxy to connecting to the whole world around you. It reminds us that we are connected to birds, that birds have a role in their ecosystem just like us, and it builds relationships between people and nature. And also, yeah, I want to just stick with birds for a second, because they really are such important creatures. I mean, they're pollinators, they are population control for insects and rodents, they are plant propagators, they are food and just sources of so many different resources, and also just like a part of their ecosystems. And I don't know if anybody here has ever seen that video about wolves in Yellowstone, but there's this concept called ecological cascades. And basically the principle is that every single living thing has such a deep role in its ecosystem and in its environment that taking it away or putting it back once it's been taken away has impacts that go so far beyond just like the immediate things that are interacting with those animals. And yeah, I won't get too deep into that right now, because it's a whole other tangent and a whole other presentation. But this concept of ecological cascades is really kind of incredible. And I think that birding, that studying the world around you, studying nature around you, is such an important way of starting to understand that we're a part of nature, and understanding that we can have a relationship there. But yeah, and we also have so many shared needs with birds as well. I mean, we all need clean water, clean air, access to green space. We need trees, we need plants. And so building relationship with birds, building relationship with wildlife, building relationship with nature is really important, because we have to learn how to balance human needs and ecological needs. People need healthy environments. People also need each other. We can't discard people or nature when finding solutions to climate issues. We also can't allow systems of oppression to be perpetuated in our conservation efforts. And we can't afford it at this point. I mean, climate change is here, it's already impacting people. So we do have to think about what we really need. And I do believe what we really need is to build positive relationships between people and nature, which brings me to my last slide, actually. And this has gone so much faster than I meant to. And I realize I speak very quickly. I'll try to talk slower for this last piece. But I want to talk about the importance of relationships. And this is something that comes up in my work, probably more than anything. I mean, in the work I do in Eastwick, you know, so much of what we try to do is build relationships between all the different stakeholders, to make sure that everybody is coming to the table with shared values, shared ambitions, and really try and craft a vision that works for everybody. I, through my work, trying to build climate resilience at River Network, so much of what we talk about is helping people build relationships between different stakeholders so that they can like access federal funds, so that they can plan sustainable projects. And we try and create guides to that. We try and help people understand how important relationships are. It always comes back to this. And when I am going out and taking photos for Healing Through the Land, I'm trying to get people out onto the circuit trails. To me, that is a part of building relationships between people and nature. And you cannot understand the value or importance of something if you don't have a relationship to it. You can't understand the importance of wetland restoration if you don't know what a wetland is. You can't understand a community unless you have a relationship with the people living in it. It's important to build relationships between stakeholders with different priorities. It's important to build relationships between people and nature, because we have to be able to advocate for each other and to protect each other. And we can't do that if we don't understand each other. So that's all I have for you. Thank you. know if I
Thanks,
should
Campbell.
exit
That was
now. Oh, yeah.
Very insightful stuff.
Hey, I guess I should probably answer questions.
Yes, think, Nilesh, do you have the chat? Can you, we'll take some questions from the room as well.
Mhm.
And Nilesh, if you can find a question from the chat and then ask them out loud.
Right.
So, does anybody have any questions in the room?
Thank you, Cam. That was amazing. Could you talk a little bit about what's the relationship building in like Eastwick, for example? Like, what does that look like when you're like first initiating those conversations and meeting people? Like, where, what kind of places are you going? And
Yeah, I mean,
You
know-
know, reading the question in case people on Zoom cannot hear.
yeah, for sure. So the question was, what does that relationship building look like? And like, for instance, in Eastwick, when you're first bringing people together, what does that relationship building really look like? And you know, it's not always pretty. I feel like there's a lot of bad blood that exists, and I'm not speaking about Eastwick specifically, but you know, when you're trying to like have local governments, for example, working with like residents, a lot of the times there is a sense of betrayal between city governments or between nonprofits and environmental groups and residents. But so I always tell people that when trying to form trusting relationships, you have to move at the speed of trust. That's like a really famous saying. I don't say that. That is said. But yeah, you have to move at the speed of trust. And when you enter into a conversation with people, I always start by just asking people if I can just talk to them. And I really do think that it starts strongest when it starts on a one-on-one basis, when you can look somebody in the eye without specific motivation, and just talk to them, talk about why you do what you do and ask them about why they do what they do and why it's important to you. And yeah, I always come back to that, just starting with a conversation and moving at the speed of trust, because the solutions that you create are strongest when they're co-created by people who trust each other to be working towards the same set of shared values. That's another piece. But having a set of shared values is really important. River Network also has a guide on building trust between utilities and I believe it's residents, but it might be like local community-based organizations. But yeah, one of the main principles in there is like establishing shared values, so that in any project that you're undertaking, in any particular thing that you're moving towards, that you know that you're working towards the same ultimate end goal. But yeah, that's some advice that I have. And also, yeah, it doesn't always look good. But yeah, that's the answer to that question.
Thank you. Just to piggyback off of that, you said sometimes it doesn't always look good. Like, what happens if you start talking to somebody and it turns adversarial, for example? What happens then?
Yeah, I mean, I've been in a lot of town halls where people are just yelling at each other. And you know, sometimes I think it's really worth it to just kind of say, okay, we're going to pick this up again tomorrow, and understand when it's not worth it to just argue and argue and argue until you reach a hole, but to come back and recenter each other. But that's also part of why having shared values is so important, because then there's always something to come back to. And yeah, and I think also I do want to emphasize again the importance of like when you're entering a community or like when you're working with a new group, that you come in without a specific idea of what you want out of them. I think that's something that I see with a lot of environmental groups, or that I like hear from a lot of environmental groups, and have also heard from frontline communities, is that they'd be like, oh yeah, like this group just came in, they wanted to build a park over here and we didn't understand like why that was happening. You know what I mean? Like you don't live here. Like, why do you get to decide what's happening with our space? And that's really real, honestly. Like, they came in with ulterior motives, and they didn't come in with the purpose of building relationships. So I also always believe in like working from your relationships. Like, where do you already have relationships? If you're an environmental organization, how can you make sure that you're always working from a place of trust? But yeah, so that's me continuing that.
Thank you.
There's nothing on the chat, so I'm gonna ask
Yeah,
a question,
yeah.
if that's okay.
Sure.
I agree with everything you said, in terms of looking at the community that you're trying to impact as a customer of what you're bringing, right? And in every customer relationship, asking the customer what they want, and then making sure you give the customer what they really need is an important part of doing any business. So if we look at it that way, often the customer does not know how to solve the problem. They know their need, but they don't know how to solve the problem. And in many of these cases, the problems that we are looking at are so complex in terms of the number of nonlinear interactions between all the environmental buckets that are present. Do you see a way to bring a solution set for the community to consider that they may not have thought of themselves? In fact, in many cases, they won't have thought of themselves, but they know what they are missing and what they need. Do you see a way to introduce a solution set for them to try out?
That's an interesting question. I think also, yeah, so basically also, I don't know if can they hear me? Can they hear the question? Should I repeat it? It's a little bit complicated to be repeated.
Did people on Zoom hear the question?
Heard them on Zoom very clearly.
Okay.
I don't know if they're in the room, I don't know, but.
Okay, well, that makes sense. Okay, yeah, so, okay, this is an interesting thought. Going back to this thought of when you're entering a community, entering without a specific agenda, I think really something that I've tried to really think through in my work, and something that I did mention earlier, how did I phrase it exactly? I just want to make sure that I'm not misquoting myself. But yeah, so if you're coming into community, there are ways to offer your expertise without enforcing your opinion over others. And I think a lot of that comes in through educational opportunities, but a lot of it comes back to just partnership work. And so recently, I think this was last year at some point, we were trying to do some work around elevating the profile of nature-based solutions as a solution in Eastwick. And we just had a group of community leaders who we had prior relationships with just come down to John Hines National Wildlife Refuge, and we just talked about nature-based solutions. Just to we're saying we're not going to make you guys do this, but we want you to know that this is something that we're working on and that we want to work on with you. And right now they're also conducting a feasibility study around more nature-based solutions. And I'm working with them to try and craft community engagement throughout that study. So a lot of the times I think a fatal flaw that a lot of different scientists, engineers, environmental nonprofits make when entering communities is that they're oh, we're just going to do the study and then present this perfectly done thing to the community, and then it doesn't actually fit what they need. So really, I would emphasize community-led research, and that's something that River Network actually has a lot of resources on if you want to check those out. But bringing community members in, yes, they know that there's a problem, and you want them to be able to lead the solution. So craft together a study to figure out what are the best options. And that's a really helpful way of making sure that you're giving them the full extent of your expertise, but also making sure that they have the opportunity to lead. And I know that that's frustrating to hear. I know that I probably can think of some specific people who would hate to hear that. But yeah, I do think that it's really crucial and important, because even though there's kind of this thought of, oh, but it's faster to just do it on our own and to just study it you're not going to do as good of a job as you would if you had the community involved. And yes, it'll be slower, but it will be more sustainable, it will be more equitable, and it will be more just. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
There is a question online from Linda, Linda Rowan. Can you talk a bit about what you're working on at Eastwick?
Yeah, I mean, my work in Eastwick is really, I just kind of originally got involved working at the Wilderness Society, and then I just built some relationships, so I kind of stayed involved. But yeah, I honestly just have relationships with the people who live in the area, and am always asking folks like, yeah, like, how can I support you all in finding a flood solution that works for you? And I offer every single facet that my education offered me. I have relationships with the folks who in the city who have been working on that work, the folks in the federal government who have been working on that work. So really all I do is just connect people and try and provide people with resources in the ways that I can. But I don't do anything really specific. It's relationship-based work. And I know it's not necessarily like a helpful answer, but yeah.
Could I say something?
Let him go.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
May I ask
Go
a
ahead.
question?
Yeah.
Please do.
And it's kind of a comment that people may find interesting. And it's involves the link between birding and land conservation. I've been working on an obituary of DVOC's very first Black member, and he grew up in the Meadows. And Campbell probably knows what that means. The Meadows is the neighborhood where Eastwick is today. And the Meadows community was an integrated community, more people of color, but some white folks as well, that went way back into the early part of the 20th century. Might have even gone back further, but there were many dwellings built in the Meadows, and it was adjacent to the marshland known as the Tinicum Marsh. And it was a thriving community where people were fishing, they were raising food in gardens, they had cows, some of them, some chickens. And Jim Carroll grew up there and explored the Tinicum Marsh and got into nature and birding. He connected to DVOC members like Johnny Miller, Robert Miller, Joe Devlin, Dwight Malotsky, a whole bunch of folks who were birding in the Tinicum Marsh in the early days. And the founder of Natural Lands Trust, Alston Jenkins, at that time was a member of DVOC, and he started an organization called the Philadelphia Conservationists, which included DVOC members and others. And he connected with Jim Carroll and Johnny Miller and others who knew Tinicum Marsh, and they set out to save Tinicum Marsh. And anyway, there was a huge community effort, and it was, as we know, it was eventually saved. But what's interesting here is how birds played a central role in the community, not just in the white community of DVOC, which was all white, right? But in the Black and mixed community in the Meadows, and people like Jim Carroll. So it's just a very cool story. Tragically, however, the Meadows was destroyed. It was razed, R-A-Z-E-D, for the first urban, so-called urban renewal project, in big quotes, in 1958. And the whole thing was wiped out except for one house. And a new development was built there, which is what we see now. And quite bizarrely, in a certain way, it was built for Black families who were being displaced from other urban renewal projects in North and West Philadelphia in the 50s. And so they took these folks, they sent them over to this new development in what was the Meadows, new families, and kicked out everybody who had been living in the Meadows, including Jim Carroll's family, et cetera. I'm not going to go on, but it's just a fascinating story that is ongoing, as Campbell has just been describing, the ongoing work to, with the Eastwick community that's there now, to really, be able to control the land, the flooding, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I guess more of a comment than a question, but just your thoughts, Campbell?
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry.
I think it's also kind of interesting because like that land is a floodplain, right? And at that point they knew it was a floodplain, and by putting Black families there, they knew that they were putting Black families in a place where there would be continual flooding. So yeah, I mean, the history of like development, the history of like displacement in this country, I feel like honestly kind of goes back to that original point of devaluing or putting profit, I guess, over human welfare and human life, and that often also results in environmental harm. And yeah, it's I honestly like, I know some about like how Eastwick came to be, but I don't know the deep history of it. But thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
It's called urban removal.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's maybe it won't have much interest, but it's I have a relationship with a group called Philly Thrive that maybe we should talk about afterwards.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware of they're an environmental justice group in the Grace Ferry area and have been dealing with Hilco, who has taken over all those brownfields that used to be the gasoline refineries. But right, so that's a very specific thing. It's important to me, and I was just wondering if you're aware of them.
I've heard of them, yeah. But I'd love to talk to you because I actually don't have any relationships with them. So start with a cup of coffee,
Okay.
See if there's ways to build together. Love that.
Okay. Judy, you wanted to ask a question?
Judy, I think you're muted if we can't hear you.
Okay, yeah, for Campbell, can you explain more of what you're talking about with the environmentalism, like with and without humans? Because it seems as if you're saying that it's wrong to protect wilderness for wilderness sake, or for the animals and the birds that live in that wilderness.
Yeah, okay, so good, thanks for asking. Yeah, so I don't ever want to perpetuate this kind of like, oh, humans on top rhetoric, because yeah, that's also another pitfall, another false solution. But really when I'm talking about humanless environmentalism, I think that it's really important to understand that humans are a part of nature, and that historically, the conservation of land, the conservation of wilderness, and I also probably am not explaining this as well as, anyways, as so many different papers that have been written on this have. But when I'm talking about humanless environmentalism, it's not that I'm saying that the land and the trees and the birds and all the living things that live there aren't worth protecting, but that humans need to be a part of the equation. And oftentimes in environmental spaces, they're not. And it results in harming people. So like, and I think that goes back to that original concept of wilderness, land untrodden by man. It's not untrodden. It's not, there was never a reality where there weren't humans, weren't people living on the land. And so I really like, and for this piece of it, I think it's really important to lean into existing Indigenous ecological knowledge. And so I'm going to give you guys a quick example. So when I was in college, I really deeply studied fire and forest management. And so pre-Spanish colonization in California and in the Pacific Northwest, there were indigenous groups, indigenous tribes, particularly the Yurok and the Mono. I can speak to those specifically because I studied it. Can't speak outside of it, but I know that this is a practice that existed beyond this place. They did what were called cultural and prescribed burns. So they would intentionally burn parts of the forest to keep the forest healthy. And there's a Mono saying actually called seeing through. And if you can see through the trees, then you have a healthy forest. And upon Spanish colonization, the Spaniards said, this is crazy. Why are you guys doing that? And also we need to let the trees grow as big as possible so that we can cut them down and sell the timber. So they enforced an era of fire suppression, which lasted for hundreds of years. And they also did a lot of work to try and keep people out of the forests. But that didn't actually help the forests. It resulted in a massive amount of buildup that wasn't supposed to be there, that fires were supposed to take out, and like natural fires as well as prescribed burns. So the healthiest kind of a forest is a forest where there are or the healthiest kind of a forest in those specific ecologies. I can't speak to other ecologies because every forest is different. But in Northern California, the healthiest kinds of forests are the forests where prescribed burns and cultural burns are still happening. So that's really what I mean, is that we are not actually creating like a healthier world when we are pretending that we can just remove people from the equation. There are ways to build sustainable futures with humans involved. So that's really what I mean, Judy, when I'm talking about a humanless environmentalism. I'm talking about an environmentalism that erases the reality of Indigenous people, and an environmentalism that is based in keeping marginalized communities outside of green space. Yeah.
Because I mean, one of the things that we see here is that whenever, you know, we try to preserve an area, the first thing that they do is put trails in it, or maybe, you know, cut down some of the trees and bushes like along these trails. And the whole idea of saving a park has to be, well, how are humans going to use it? Let's put athletic fields here or whatever. You know, that seems to be the you know, the way things are done here, that the humans are important, but and in creating a space for humans, we're destroying the natural area.
Well, it's a balance, right? You can't go completely in one direction. You can't raise an entire forest and pave it with a parking lot. But you also can't just pretend like it makes sense to remove people from a place. Does that make sense? I'm not saying that we shouldn't try and cultivate land to be in its quote unquote natural state, but we should be able to, we should be trying to create land that is healthy and sustainable, that is not completely separate from human existence. And so I think that there is a middle ground there. I don't think that it's one or the other, right? And I think that in order to create sustainable and just solutions, that we are including people in the equation, and that we're not removing them, and that we're also not, you know, completely disregarding nature. And so, like I said before, like we need solutions that hold both the well-being of people and nature. And I think that oftentimes, yeah, no, I'm gonna stop there because I kind of lost the thought that I was having, but yeah.
I think there's something to be, sorry, was there a question?
Oh, finish your thought.
Oh, sorry. Between people and profit, like some of the things that we see that destroy nature are done in the name of profit, not people.
Yes. Yeah, I think that that's really central. So that actually I feel like really sums up the thought that I was trying to articulate, but really struggling to, is that a lot of the times also profit is really the driver there. It's not even that like, oh, we're prioritizing people, because we're not actually prioritizing people. We're prioritizing profit. We're prioritizing what will make us more money, that will make an institution more money, instead of trying to protect nature and actually protect people as best we can. But yeah, so I think that that's an excellent point. Thank you for sharing that. And I also think I saw another question over here.
My question is gonna reference some other people's comments, so for your people to give my notes.
Yeah, thank you.
But I know there were some comments about, stakeholders and, this kind of distant web community and how to sort of present a set of solutions or approaches that might be, or that haven't been done or brought up by, said community. I'm looking at this slide that you have up about the importance of relationships. And I'm just thinking about nonprofits and even the kinds of language we use in these institutions with like stakeholders. And I feel like that suggests a sort of ranking, there are like stakeholders who are at the top and stakeholders who are at the bottom, depending on what they can contribute to a project or whatever. I bring this up to you, and I want to connect you to that community comment. Running a toolkit to just think about if we were to reframe stakeholders and communities, but as like neighbors in an expansive way. Yeah. Because if it's not you now, it's going to be you soon, kind of thing, right? There's like people who are going to go into certain communities and offer solutions that are, I think, going to be relevant to their imminent experience or like something similar. I'm going to tie this together, I found this, but so some of these solutions are frequently responsive to issues that frontline communities have noticed, but you may not necessarily have like platforms or the sort of like political advocacy to get them to be taken as seriously as, other issues. I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about, how political advocacy and sort of upstream approaches to climate resilience and sort of advocating for people before something happens and not just to present solutions in response to something that people have been, perhaps like calling attention to. Do you have examples of that in your work life or that you've seen, I don't know, peers, colleagues, like speak on like how can environmentalists and climate organizations like advocate for people at the earliest stages and not just when a crisis happens.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because actually earlier today I was having a conversation with somebody about integrated floodplain management, and really what they were talking about was trying to create a model for people who live throughout a watershed, because also for information's sake, I have been in a meeting where we were talking about watersheds the entire time and somebody said, "Where's the watershed? Can we move it?" And it's like, all right, let's make sure that we're defining our terms. But so a watershed is a system of rivers, lakes, water bodies that connect to each other, impact each other, and then lead out into a larger water body. But when you live in a watershed, every decision that you make, whether you're building a gas station or you're using water for like whatever resources, every decision that you make is going to impact other people that live in the floodplain or that live in the watershed, particularly if you're living on a floodplain in the watershed. But so that's why it's so important to start early and to have conversations around this integrated floodplain management concept, which is getting stakeholders throughout a watershed into the same room and building relationships early, building relationships before there are really there are always going to be problems. Like there's no watershed in the world that has zero problems. We're all fine. Like somebody has something going on all the time. Maybe there is some watershed out there somewhere that's perfect, but I haven't found it. But yeah, and so we were talking about how powerful it is to get, and I'm going to use the word stakeholders, and maybe that's a failed term, but local governments, residents, community-based organizations that live throughout a watershed in conversation with each other. And so that I think, and we've just kind of been like toying with this, trying to figure out how we can build out a resource around this, try and help people figure out how to do it in their own communities. But I do think that kind of building relationships early and often is really central to preventative measures, number one, when you are pursuing solutions, that you are building positive relationships with people, or that you're pursuing solutions that are really equitable and that will work for a lot of different people. But I really like that question, because also I think that question of like, oh yeah, stakeholders, and like, oh, we're coming into a community and they're a customer. I really want us to think about the communities that we work in as more than just like, I don't know, I try to think of the communities that I work in as more than just a job, and more about a partnership towards creating a future that we can both live in. Because honestly, I mean, I'm not paid that much. I'm not even paid for everything that I do. I'm like, I volunteer a lot of my time. And that's because I really do want to build a sustainable future. That's because I really want to, create something that's actually going to last. And so that brings me back to the what do we really need versus false solutions. I think that when you're trying to chase after profit, a lot of the times it lends itself to false solutions. And what we really need, I think oftentimes will not be funded, unfortunately. But yeah, sorry, I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent there, but yeah.
Anything else on Zoom? Any raised hands?
I haven't seen it.
Cool. That might just be it.
I guess we have nothing else. I'll ask one last question.
Cool.
You mentioned people of Eastwick being Philadelphia's first climate refugees. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in various places.
Right.
What are some local solutions to like rising sea level, climate change, things like that?
That is a really good question and a really hard one to answer. Because
sorry, Campbell, could you repeat that? It was a little hard to hear on Zoom, the question.
yeah, the question was, what are some local solutions to climate change? But yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of different kind of like interim solutions at the moment. Like, for example, the Office of Sustainability is working on putting in HESCO barriers to make sure that at the very least communities are protected. Some people want to do buyouts, but you know, legally that is extraordinarily complicated when you have a community of attached homes, particularly in Pennsylvania. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but it is really difficult to cultivate solutions that work for everybody, because number one, there are a lot of laws that you kind of have to navigate around. And there are a lot of different ideas about what needs to happen. But I can say that there are a lot of nature-based solutions being executed right now, that there is a lot of like wetland restoration happening, and that in pursuing more nature-based solutions, like I was mentioning earlier, there are more feasibility studies happening in which the community is being brought in from the inception of it, really, and that they are kind of co-creating solutions like as we speak. But yeah, there was discussion of building of a levee from the Army Corps of Engineers, and there were a lot of critiques of that levee. And then yeah, and we actually just finished submitting comments on it yesterday. So, you know, it's one step at a time. But yeah, that's a really difficult question, because there's not just one solution, right? It's always going to be a network of many different solutions. And that's something that like anybody working in like climate solutions will tell you, is that it's never just one thing, one size fits all. Oh, we got it. Oh, we figured it out. But it's always going to be a network of a lot of different things that a lot of different people are working on in order to keep communities safe. But yeah.
And are there things that say like an organization like DVOC or other voting groups are not necessarily involved with some of this work, but how do we contribute? Can we help in some way? Do you have any thoughts, suggestions?
I feel like I'm being so annoying with this whole relationships thing, but I do think that being present in a place like goes a really long way. And I was having a conversation with a different colleague earlier today about how our work was kind of similar, but it wasn't touching each other yet. And I just said, let's just stay in conversation. And when there's a moment for collaboration, we can pursue it. But so, if you have no like ulterior motives right now, if it's just based on pure relationship building for relationship building's sake, then you'll probably go a lot further in actually being helpful. But yeah, that's not necessarily that useful, but it is the piece that I always come back to, because there's no just like easy answer to any of these questions.
Last call for questions.
And also, I just want to say, I do work in Eastwick, like I have been talking about it a lot, but there are also a lot of other environmental justice issues in Philadelphia. There are like lead pipes in schools. There is like food inequity. There are so many different things that people can be involved in. So I really just like encourage people to learn more, to meet people who are doing this work, and to try and just step by step figure out how you can be a part of your community, how you can understand the issues that are happening around you, and eventually be able to contribute your expertise and your knowledge.
Thank you. Barbara, any last words before we end the meeting?
Why don't we all recycle more? I mean, we can't all put up levies, and we can't all, do things that need to be done on a large scale, but we can certainly start in our own little corner. For those of you who live in Philadelphia, there is a very good recycling outfit called Rabbit Recycling. And since we know that the Philadelphia trash people don't always recycle the trash, what I have been doing is sending, having them having Rabbit Recycling pick up trash or recycled items that I know that the city won't, in particular plastics. So anything plastic, any level of plastic that I try to get rid of that. And that's what I can do. I mean, as I said, we can't all build big things and do what, but we can do every little thing helps.
Okay. Thank you all.